Okay, it's lovely to see you all. Tonight's talk is, as you can see, on London Docklands Railway, the development of rail transport in London Docklands. I shall admit to a strong personal interest in this. For a while, my father was a very humble ticket clerk in London Docklands at Tidal Basin Station. Unfortunately, he wasn't there in the war when it was bombed. But it's ever since then, it's always made me very eager to look at railway layouts in London Docklands and around the Isle of Dogs. So when John Willis kindly agreed to give this paper, I thought, yes, that's one for me. Thank you very much, John. John spent his career working on London transport development for the Greater London Council, successively London Transport and Transport for London. He was responsible for the initial planning of the Docklands Light Railway and the City, Beckton and Lewisham extensions and the Jubilee Line extension. And his final position is Head of Planning at Crossrail. He's a keen member of the Newcomen Society, I know we've corresponded before, and past chairman of Crofton Beam Engines, and I'm delighted to say as a trailer the Society is going to have a picnic at Crofton in the middle of next year to celebrate our centenary. John, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a huge subject to cover in an hour, so apologies if I take it at a fairly fast pace. My job as a transport engineer or a transport planner was about engineering. Engineering is often thought of that bit, which is construction. But that is only part of the story. Identifying the problem, devising solutions, evaluating alternatives, cost benefits, financial, environmental impacts are all part of the engineering process. And I think it's very important that we don't actually forget. Okay, London Docklands, well, I suspect you're all familiar, if you're familiar living in London or near London. We're talking about this area 12 kilometres down from Tower Bridge. Very briefly, I'll go through a history of the docks. The need for the enclosed docks arose at the end of the 18th century when the Pool of London became overcrowded. And apparently in 1790 there was something like 13,500 ships and 3,500 lighters operating in the pool. And there were incredible delays, 6 or 8 weeks or more, and there was a huge amount of pilfering. So, what happened? Well, William Pitt set up a select committee, they haven't even in those days, and he found that the current resources were incompetent to the great purpose of its extended commerce. So they decided they did need some enclosed docks, but they could not decide where they should go or who should operate them, because the city was very parochial and looked after the Pool of London, and they were really a bit wary about anybody else taking some of their business. But they did let the private companies in, and that started this major construction period over the first half of the 19th century. The 5 docks in the eastern part were all constructed pretty well in the first half of that century. The Royals at the other end were first constructed 1855, and then 1895, and eventually the King George V was constructed in 1919. So some of these wonderful docks were I love the West India docks, how it was. It was an absolutely magnificent piece of engineering. And these 3, the import docks and the export docks. And the ships could come in, they could discharge their cargo, and then they could go around to the export dock without having to go out onto the Thames. So it was a tidal-free area, a brilliant. And John Rennie, of course, was involved in that, and it opened in 1802. I'll just digress a tiny little bit. Look at that area there. See very faintly, it says engine. Now, as you say, my other role has been helping to look after Crofton. and Crofton, the first engine for Crofton, was bought from the West India Dock Company. They used them for building the docks, and then probably carried on using them for keeping the docks topped up. The engine we got was in pieces. I don't think it was complete, and we don't know whether it actually had been used in the West India docks or whether it was something else. That's enough about Crofton. Then the London docks, 1805, St Catherine's at the very left-hand end in 1828. They started to become specialised. London docks were basically wine and spirits, tobacco. One of them is called tobacco docks. Skipping over the other side of the East India docks, 1806, the Blackwall docks, the East India docks. You see here some very old docks. It's reputed that these were where, not built, but certainly maintained, was where the Mary Rose was actually maintained in some of those docks. But these East India docks, built without big warehouses, because their goods, which came obviously from Indonesia and India, high value, they wanted to take them directly to their secure warehouses in the city. So no immediate great warehouses. The Surrey commercial docks, actually the first one was, the previous name of Greenland Dock was Howland Dock, and that was actually opened in 1679, as it says there. And then over the first part of the century, this real mess of docks, and you can tell, you know, Russia, Quebec, Canada, they were all to do with, particularly at the end, whaling. In 1864, they all joined together and made a single dock company. The Millwall docks, 1868, the bottom of the Isle of Dogs. You can see here, not connected to the West India docks. You may have seen on that first diagram, there was actually a city canal across there. That was built, the city were worried about East India docks taking their trade. So they built this city canal with the misguided feeling that ships would avoid having to go all the way around the Isle of Dogs, which of course is very tricky with a sailing ship. And they would build this shortcut. It was a white elephant, because by the time people had locked in and locked out, and the ships were dragged across by horses, it took just as long to go around the Isle of Dogs. So you can see here, the West India dock has taken it over, and they've converted it into a timber. So at the other end, we have the Victoria Dock, 55, 1879, and the King George V was really built as a job creation scheme after the First World War. So, how were goods taken away? Well, traditionally by horse and cart. This is West India Dock. These are most likely rum from the West Indies. This is one of the buildings that has survived, or most of the rest being bombed. That's where the London Docklands Museum is. And this is the Ledger building, which also survived, which is a wonderful place where massive great books and lots of clerks and every good that came in and out was recorded. And that building still exists. So, along came railways. And you probably all know about this one. Not the first railway in London, the second railway in London, the London and Blackwall. And it was primarily seen initially as a link to the passenger steamers which used to run from Blackwall down the Thames, places like Southend and Margate for leisure trips. You probably all know about this one, the old cable hauled railway, hemp cable, 7 miles long, operate very much like the San Francisco cable cars. The brakeman or driver, whatever it's called, would grip the cable and then off the train would go. And then they had this curious way of intermediate stations, they would drop the cars off at the intermediate stations and then pick them up on the way back. The 7-mile cable didn't last very long because the rats ate it. And it was also reputed to be the first place where electric signalling was used, probably some sort of simple bell system for the guys running the steam engines at both ends to start them up. This, I think, is West Ferry Station. Here you can see the line just coming through the Isle of Dogs. The Millwall Docks hasn't been built, just the West Indies at the top. We'll see later, if this had not existed, I don't think Docklands would have been anything like what we have today. It ran into the city, and basically goods yards were developed to serve the city. So it was a very short distance, taking goods from particularly the West India docks into the city, into storage yards. And originally it only went to Minories, and that was because when it went to Parliament, there was this resistance about taking railways into the centre of within the city. It was only a few years later that they got permission to run into Fenchurch Street. This is Blackwall Station. And from the mid-19th century onwards, railway mania came to Docklands. And over the years, developed into a massive network. Particularly here, the three railways. A lot of competition between them. They did have some joint running agreements, so they did run over each other's lines from time to time. But it grew until virtually land was in the docks was either water or railways. And some of the very outlying bits were not run by steam engines. They were people manhandled them or used horses to pull the trucks together. But you can see here total confusion of different companies. Couple of pictures here around Blackwall, Millwall Junction. I started work in Docklands in the early 70s, and I remember I stood on the remains of Millwall Junction, Blackwall. It was still existing there, because there were still then freight trains coming down the Poplar branch to Blackwall. A couple of lovely stations on the Millwall extension. Love the way these guys have all been lined up to have their photographs taken. We shouldn't forget at the western side of Docklands, the East London Line. You all know about that, of course, Mr. Brunel's tunnel. 1865 was when it actually had a railway running through it. It was used by workers going to, but I don't think it had a huge freight impact on the Surrey docks. It was mainly just used for passengers. Over at the Royals, we had the Eastern Counties and Thames Junction Railway. The first one opened in 1847, and that was the line to Woolwich, from Stratford, down from Stratford to Woolwich. When the dock came in 1855, this was the only entrance into the dock, and so they decided on an alternative route. So in 1855, this one was open via the northern side of the docks. (1872) was the branch going up to the Beckton Gasworks, which is worth a talk in itself, about the way that was served by railways at two different levels. And then finally, 1880, the line down to galleons, probably anticipating the construction of the second docks. Of course, when the Albert was built, this became a difficulty. So initially there was a spring bridge, and again in the early 70s the remains of that swing bridge was still there. You could walk across it. But of course, they decided to build a tunnel underneath, the Connaught Tunnel. And as we'll see later, this is the part of the only route in central London which is used by Crossrail. And that tunnel there caused them a few little problems. The line went out, this line went out as well as serving the docks to galleons, where there's magnificent hotel, which is being restored, where people would stay before catching steamers, which at that time could go to France and other places. A couple of other pictures about a lovely old train sitting in Custom House Station, and this is at North Woolwich, quite a complex range of lines. So, this is the basis of the first network of railways to serve London Docklands. Goods were taken away by a train, but certainly the manhandling of goods was still widespread. You had the call-on system, which was the, I suppose, the original 0 hours contract, where men used to have to turn up early in the morning, and you have a job today, and the others go home. If another ship came in later, there was another call on later that morning. Pretty ruthless system, and if you were in favour with the guy who was choosing, then you might have some work. But the companies were really quite inefficient. There's competition between the docks and the companies. New investment was needed. Bigger ships, mechanisation, and cranes were desperate. This is a scene probably in the 60s, no, probably earlier than that, late 50s, in the Royal Docks. And although this was well served by railways on the other side of here, there was still a tradition that quite a lot of goods were taken by lighter and then taken upstream. By the turn of the century, the government decided that they should nationalise the docks. And in 1909, the PLA was set up. They did put investment in, but then they had to suffer the 2 world wars, which were devastating on the docks. And at the same time, as they were starting to put money into investment, ships getting larger, the docks were too small. Labour relations were terrible. Those of you old as me can remember the dock strikes, the labour strikes which spread throughout the country. Really a very difficult time for the PLA. And then, of course, this happened. Containers came along. Almost overnight, they eliminated the wastage, or the stealing, I like to call it, from the docks. Containers need large backlands, basically to store the containers, basically then to have a system of getting them off the ships and taken away. London Docklands just didn't have that space, and so essentially London Docks moved to Tilbury. The dock closures started basically the late 60s and continued over 13 years very rapidly as containers came in. So those were the times when they were closed, and they left these large areas. This is obviously looking down at the Royal Docks. Large areas of wasteland, a lot of it contaminated, and this is a picture of the Isle of Dogs. You just see that's the remains of the original building. This is North Quay, South Quay, and Canary Wharf. So what to do? Well, the time filming. So Surrey Docks was seen basically as a landfill site. There were various ideas for it, but essentially it was filled in. First, this is where the printing works first were relocated from Fleet Street. And you remember all the problems we had, was it in the 70s with quarrying here, with printing disputes. What's left of water? Well, a little bit up here, a little bit of Canada water, and the old Howland Dock or Greenland Dock. But it was seen as, water was not seen as a huge asset. Basically, the land was more valuable. Similarly, in the London docks in St Catherine's. Again, Blackwall Basin was retained, St Catherine's was retained, because by that time, it's seen the potential for a very upmarket boat park, probably the most expensive in the world. So that was kept, that piece of water was kept simply for financial reasons. The East India Docks had really run down much earlier. In fact, that was the location where the Mulberry Harbours were built for the invasion. But again, pretty well filled in, a little bits of water remained. Brunswick Power Station was built here and then subsequently demolished years later. So what to do with the other areas? Well, there was a major plan in 76, and you see here the Isle of Dogs basically all filled in, and the Rod Docks, these two docks at this time, those were actually seen as continuing operation. But obviously the Victoria is closed. There was a transport proposal, and that was a fleet line, river line, whatever you'd like to call it, but it was impossible to justify it. There were seen to be probably about 25,000 jobs in this area, about the same as had been when the docks were working, and although little bits of this were actually started in the central area, actually around Cannon Street and around, where's the other place? Somewhere in the city, you can actually go and see in the basement of buildings, little bits of this line were actually built. So what to do? Well, the GLC and the boroughs could not agree anything. They all had their different interests about what to do. So, in 81, Margaret Thatcher's government stepped in and said, we've got to sort this out in a different way. It was a pretty ruthless approach. It took away the planning powers from the local authorities, gave them to an unelected body called the London Docklands Development Corporation. They designated an enterprise zone in the middle where there will be capital grants and freedom from local authority rates for 10 years. So the Development Corporation, their aim was to bring back regeneration. They realised that transport was a key. And really in this area, apart from the East London line, the District line, this transport development, railway development had passed this area by. Because in the traditional docks, most people walked to work or went on the bus, or there were a few trams. There was no need to have a commuter system. There was no need really to connect it to central London. So when all the tube and other lines were developed, Docklands did not get that investment. So this was set up by Michael Heseltine. And this is when I started getting involved. We started to think, well, what on earth could you do? How could you improve transport, which was appropriate for that level of development, using, as far as possible, bits of these old railway alignments. And this is one of the ideas, to run buses on some parts of the lines. So these are the lines which were now redundant. This was closed in 28, that bit was closed in the 50s, and this bit ran down to Poplar Docks in the early 70s. So what can we do with these rights of way? First ideas, we looked at trams. And we looked at running along the commercial road into Aldgate, running up Burdett Road to Mile End, or using the Poplar branch and then rising quickly and going down the street to Mile End. Two things happened which made that it is quite a significant decision. First was we realised we put a steep gradient here, we could climb up and get onto the Eastern Region line where there was a spare freight track which hadn't been used very much and a spare A platform at Stratford. The other reason was this was obviously run by, what are they called these days? C2C or something? Four tracks. At this time, National Rail, or British Rail I should say, demand was falling. And I can remember a meeting with them, we approached them and said, conceivably, would you give up 2 of those tracks? And they said, oh yes, we're quite happy to do that. That decision has been bitterly regretted ever since by private railways, by the privatised railways, because it means they only have 2 tracks all the way through, and previously they were able to. So if we hadn't got that, we wouldn't have the DLR. So eventually we came up with the light rail running to Tower Gateway, 17 stations, 11 trains, very cheap and cheerful railway. In fact, one of the councillors I remember at a meeting because I used to go and do public meetings, the councillor said, this is a Mickey Mouse railway. And unfortunately, when it wasn't running that well, that name was used quite a lot in the press. It was cheap and cheerful. It was not justified. It was not justified in the cost-benefit analysis, which I did. So how was it approved? The Department of Transport didn't want to go ahead with it. They said, no, it's not justified in transport terms, we can't do it. We did an exercise talking to estate agents, all those sort of people, and we worked out that if we did this, it would generate 9,000 more jobs than if we just ran buses. Michael Hesterstein loved that, and he gave the go-ahead. I've actually asked him, how did he persuade government to go ahead when his fellow Minister David Howell didn't want to go? And he said, I just announced it at the Tory party conference. There's never been a railway in this country approved so quickly. We put the submission in July, he approved it at the conference in October. It was extraordinary. It was not the first railway to be fully accessible. That was, of course, the time when Metro was followed on quite soon afterwards. It could negotiate 25-metre curves and light trains. Because if they'd been heavy, we wouldn't have been able to use the old viaducts. And this is the Limehouse Viaduct, which really, we had to replace the bridges, cut down the butt which was growing all over it, move the drainage, but we could reuse it. And there's a train behind it, is the, I'm sure some of you know what that is, London main accumulator. I've always thought I should investigate that more because it's a fascinating subject. Anyway, staying on railways. This is an artist's impression of going across the Isle of Dogs. This was the only part where we put new structure. We didn't follow the old alignment, because by this time the Development Corporation wanted to have a fully segregated railway, which we could do. They didn't like the possibility of overhead wires, so we had the third rail pickup, and they didn't want it to run on street. So across the centre of the Isle of Dogs, this structure was built. And I show this because that was one of the first offices that was built in Docklands. And if we hadn't had that railway, Docklands would probably be full of those types of offices. The lovely old viaduct to the bottom of the Isle of Dogs, we were able to reuse again. You can just see the strengthening tie bars which had to go through there. But otherwise, that beautiful structure, which had been dormant since 1928, could be reused again. I took this picture in about 1986, just before the DLR opened. And this was about a year before the DLR opened. I was called to an early morning meeting with the boss then of the Underground, or the boss of DLR, which was Tony Ridley. And because these Americans had asked for a meeting, and they walked in the door, and they put this on the table. And we just could not believe our eyes. They wanted to build 10 million square feet of offices. To the first phase would double the employment from 25,000 to 50,000. Canadian developers started off, but they realised after not very long that they couldn't cope with it. So, sorry, American developers started off. Canadian developers in New York took it over 1 or 2 years later. It all happened because of the Big Bang. The Big Bang was deregulation of the banks. There was an immediate demand for open plan trading floors, because they were doing away with the old trading floors where people used to shout at each other. They wanted large open plan offices. They wanted a lot of room for computers and other equipment. And also the city corporation was very restrictive in terms of their planning policies. They didn't want any of their buildings knocked down. They actually didn't want some of them converted into these open plan. So it was a combination of those things. The fact that the DLR was there and was just about to open, which would improve this access from Canary Wharf into the city, meant that this development could happen. It was an extraordinary coincidence of factors. The developers wanted to get, they thought the bank was the central of the universe, they wanted to get there. So they were prepared to contribute to the extension to bank. I'm rather proud of this picture because the original, because I drew it. The first plan was actually to put the railway underneath the Mansion House, which was just about here, sitting on top. And we put the bill into Parliament, and suddenly the City Corporation came up and said, stop. We have a very, very sensitive building on there with very, very poor footings. And if you tunnel underneath there, you put a decent big station, we're going to have problems. So basically within 24 hours, I was asked to, well, I didn't ask, I sort of produced this plan, stuck it under the boss's table and said, can we stick it underneath the Northern Line rather than the other side? And that's actually what happened, was built. The connection through to, there are lots of links, this connection through to the Central Line used to be when the Waterloo and City Line connected to the Central Line, there was a through. So we decided, this was used for getting all the spoil out for digging the railway. we decided to use it as a pedestrian link, make it permanently. But this section, you see, is narrower, and that's where it goes under the mansion house, because they were very concerned about the footing. So over this section, probably about 50 metres, the tunnel goes to a smaller diameter. Also along there, you can see the remains of the original Gateshead shield, which was used to build that connection between Waterloo and City. Oops, gone wrong way. The station, the best decision we ever made was to build it for 3-car trains. At that time, we'd only envisaged 2-car trains. That's what we thought the Canary Wharf would need. So we built it for 2-car trains. We made 1 or 2 other silly decisions. We had a single track overrun. So trains had to leave the station, go into a single track, 1 set of points. And if that set of points failed, the whole station was out of action. And typically you have two tracks, so you can use either. Today that problem has been overcome because the trains are fully automatic, and in emergency they can go into the wrong platform. Or, I mean the different platform, not the wrong one. We didn't build the escalators wide enough. We put 2 small escalators, there should have been 3. Other things, it really was a cost-saving exercise. Not a very clear diagram, but today, Bank is being totally rebuilt. Very briefly to explain, the Northern Line, which is the, get it right, the southbound Northern Line, because for some reason the lines are the wrong way round. The northbound is on the left, and somebody will explain that to me why. Basically, that Northern Line is being moved out. This is a new tunnel which is being constructed. In the middle then you get a vast concourse, you get banks of escalators going up, you get new escalators going down to the DLR, and you get a travelator going all the way along to the Central Line. A massive, massive improvement. So if you go to the DLR station at the moment, it's a mess. Bank is a mess. But this is actually under construction at the moment. Another problem we had was 6% grade. There was well, first of all, we only just got in time before this building was built, and we were able to persuade them to move the piles apart so we could actually tunnel through it. If we missed that, it would have been a much more expensive job. You then got the 6% grade, and the problem there is, can you restart a fully laden train in a wet condition on the 6%? There was a concern, and there was actually a design for completely covering this approach with to keep the rain off. But the first test, where they stopped a fully laden train, artificially loaded with barrels of water, and it worked perfectly, so there was no need for the canopy. Canary Wharf Station, which never properly opened, was totally rebuilt. And the timing we had for this is one of the many times I worked over the weekends. We had to design this station because the buildings were starting to be planned. The station needed to be redesigned. We had all sorts of ideas coming from above, looking down to the platforms or going up. This, I think, I'm pretty proud of this. You've got 2 island platforms, which then you go down escalators down to the subway below. The side platforms go out into the development. You don't get the chances very often to design a station and a building at the same time. We had other little problems. When you design steel structures these days, you design them for 120 years life. That's the standard engineering design. So the original steel was designed for 120 years life. We were going to run more trains more frequently and double length trains. When the calculations were done, it meant that 120 years life came down to 30 years. So if you go around DLR, you will find bits of steel added to these structures, and that's the reason. So, 1991, the bank extension opened. The next one was the Beckton extension. How are we doing for time? This is the Royal Docks. Here we have this wonderful River Lee. Instead, there was one idea to actually cut through there and make it more development land here, but they realised that all the silt would rush down the River Lee and block the Thames, so they didn't pursue that. This was an interesting thing because the Development Corporation wanted the railway to run straight across here because they wanted to get to their development areas as rapidly as possible. So when the Development Corporation was the planning authority, but London Transport was the transport authority. So when we went to Parliament, our dear friends in Newham petitioned against the bill. And they said, we want you to go via Canning Town. There was the Canning Town British Rail Station here. And the committee decided in their favour. And the extraordinary thing about parliamentary bills, you're given about 3 hours to make up your mind. So they sent us out, said, are you going to do this? If you don't do it, the bill is lost. And that's how the parliamentary committees work. And several ones I was involved in, that actually happened. So we ended up doing the circuitous route, which in the end has not proved too bad. So the Beckton extension, at the time, the Development Corporation thought, well, we've got all this going in the Isle of Dogs. It's all going to happen down the Royals as well. It hasn't. And it's still, although there's probably a little bit more than what I showed here, there's still not a huge development happening. This is one of the interesting bits. Again, when you have the opportunity to design a railway along with other things, in this case a road, you can do things rather differently. Here the DLR does run through here at low level, but the road is at high level. So you end up with 3 levels. The railway at the bottom, you've got a pedestrian route here, which means people can walk from the north side of the road and railway to the south side without crossing any road, and then you have the road on the top. Again, it's only rarely you get this opportunity you can sit down and design these things. Well, the DLR can cope with the 50,000 jobs and more, but if that was going to increase beyond there, we needed more transport. So this was in 1988. Various things were looked at, and you could say this is where the first ideas for the London Overground came, the extension of the East London Line north and south, the Lewisham extension, Woolwich Crossing, that time seen by British Rail as a British Rail service, and then the connection to Barking. All of those have been completed apart from this thing. The idea now is to link Barking into this area with an extension of the overground, and that is, I think, is under construction. It's certainly been approved. So the next DLR extension was Lewisham, which was unusual for DLR because it wasn't on any existing rights of way. It was a complicated project. The first, this is the bottom of the Isle of Dogs, Mudchute Station was initially elevated away to the ground. Put this slide up, it's a lovely name, Mudchute, because when the Millwall docks were built, the mud was shot over here. And that is now a raised area which is a city farm on it. And that's where the word Mudchute came from. When we got down towards the river, we had to abandon the lovely old viaduct. So that was used for, I think it's about 11 years, and then has gone back to its rest as a lovely Grade 2 listed building. So the DLR Lewisham extension comes under here. I'm not sure about the design of this. But there we are. That's the Island Garden station, which is underground. The railway then had to take this tortuous route, jumping across the Deptford Creek or River Ravensbourne on single columns, a really intricate piece of design. And here you can see the tortuous route as it goes across. And then the interesting thing, this was a little further south. This is the River Ravensbourne, which used to run in a concrete channel along here. So rather than putting the railway in the park, the idea was to move the river into the park and use the concrete channel, which hardly needed any expansion to run the DLR. So, Lewisham Bactrian stations opened in 1944, so 1994 and 1999. So, returning to the Royals. We had the Beckton extension, which was operational, and your chairman mentioned Thames Wharf. Thames Wharf is there, where there used to be a station on the North Woolwich line, and now, sorry, is it not Thames Wharf? Tidal Basin. Tidal Basin, sorry, wrong name. Tidal Basin, one is going to be built again, called Tidal Basin. So the next thing was to then run the extension to the city airport. First of all, over that old bit which used to be called the Silvertown Tramway, which was the original line going down to Woolwich, up to the airport. Initially it went to the King George V, and then the later extension went over to Woolwich. This is one of the stations, again, making maximum use of the capability of the DLR to go up 6% gradients. And this is just a shot showing where it zigzags up and serves the airport. And I think that is the highest number of people go by public transport to London City Airport as with any airport in the UK. And obviously because the DLR is literally paces away from the airport entrance. And this is the station at Woolwich, right in the middle of the town centre, aimed at regenerating not a very happy part of London, but this has certainly stimulated some of the area. Finally, we come to the other extension, taking over the old Eastern Region line, coming up to with intermediate stations, and then of course ending up in London Stratford International Station. Originally, way back when the international station was proposed, they had a planning inquiry. I gave evidence at that planning inquiry saying you can't stick that station up there without a decent connection to the regional station. The inspector agreed, but it took another 20 years or more to actually establish the link with the DLR. And of course it doesn't just serve the station, it serves a massive housing development which is taking all around. So this is the DLR. Stretched, pulled apart, rebuilt. Not a very happy story in some cases, but I think it's got to the stage now when it has settled down. It is, I think, the most sophisticated light railway in the world. It's got completely automatic operation. Trains they know where the one in front is and they decide how close they can get to it. They know what speed it is, and of course they can immediately turn around and go back the other way down the wrong road if required. When we did the forecast of the railway, we were talking about something like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 million passengers per annum. That's what it was planned for originally. All the extensions have obviously added to it, and we're now talking around about 120,000 that's about 120 million people using it every year. Massive increase in number of stations, trains. Probably still about 60% of it runs on former rights of way. But it's not enough. The forecast then for going up and up, and the Isle of Dogs was now projected to be 100,000, 4 times what we started off for. So thoughts started to concern about what we do next. And there was a whole range of studies during the 70s and 80s. Central London Rail Study, Central London Rail Study, East London Rail Study, all looking at various ideas of how we might improve capacity, particularly looking at extensions out into Docklands. The developers were pushing for a new railway. They came up with this called the Waterloo Bench Railway. London Trust was not very keen on it because it thought it might end up a bit like the drain, the Waterloo and City Line. A lot of people going one direction in the peak, a lot of people going the other direction in the peak, and not a great deal of other use, unless it was extended, but it wasn't at that stage proposed to extend. But essentially that led through to, obviously, the Jubilee Line extension. There were big decisions which were taken, particularly whether to carry on from the existing station at Charing Cross or to go south. And at this time, Covent Garden and other places were becoming very popular for mass tourism. And the boroughs around here said it would be wonderful if we could take it south of the Thames to open up that side of the Thames. And the director, or then director of the Tate, said, if you go to south of the river, we might make this a really good art gallery at the old power station. So that was one of the key decisions, why it went south of the Thames. And it worked. I mean, if you've sure velocity water on the South Bank now, it's a very, very popular place. There was another decision of whether to cut the corner at here or serve North Greenwich. At this stage, the dome had not been thought about, and it was all about whether we should serve a potential development area here. And of course, we decided to go south. I'm going to quickly just go through one or two stations. This one in particular, because this is the Jubilee Line station, and the two tubes are stacked on top of each other, basically to keep away from this object. That object moves when the tide comes in, the tide goes out. And there was great concern that we were going to make it move even more. So that's why they're stacked on top, and a huge block of concrete was put under the bottom here. We had the other complication that the MPs wanted to build their new accommodation on top. It was all quite difficult. But as the tunnelling was bored through here, this was very carefully monitored, and it was allowed to move just about 2 inches, and then compensation grouting was squirted ahead of the boring machine to push it back. And the guy who masterminded that was John Burland from Imperial College, who went on to sort out the Leaning Tower of Pisa. World expert in ground movement. I love this station, I think it's fabulous. Massive, huge columns in the middle which support the MP's accommodation above.
Ideal for gunpowder bombs.
I should. Above here we have the district line. And because the MPs, there was concern about the bombs, we had to put I think it's nearly a metre thick or more, slab of concrete above this station and below, no, it's above the district line. So the district line actually had to be lowered. Terribly complicated project, but it was all to do with national security. This is Canada Water. Again, interchange with the East London line, now London Overground, a massive major interchange. When we came to Canary Wharf, well, ideally it would have gone in the middle, under the tower, but the tower's already been built, so of course it went in the water. And the problem here is we've got water either side, so the station has to be very deep to be able to get under the Thames. So we have this lovely station with huge escalators going down to a particular level, and then another huge layer going down below. Canning Town, the DLR was already there. What could we do? Well, we pushed the DLR up in the air to put the Jubilee Line underneath it. This is the old British Rail service, or Network Rail. Of course, that's now part of the DLR. That's right. Again, a complex project. We have these little these wires hanging over above, as well as high voltage for the engineers. Have a lovely job. Huge big depot built. So when it was approved, 130 million, 33 million passengers per annum, more than doubled. How do you predict these things? It now has a very sophisticated moving block signalling system, and they're planning to go up from over 30 to 36 trains per hour. But Docklands and London continues to grow. We've already exceeded the peak, which was in the 50s, and we're now getting on for 9 million. And the ideas or plans that probably we might go to about 11 million within the next 20 years. So to basically cope with that, we need something else. So along comes Crossrail. Crossrail, I think, has these three main purposes. Obviously, to support continuing growth of Docklands, to support Heathrow, particularly if there is a fifth terminal, and above all, to do something about the congestion on the underground. Currently, it's about 60% of people travel by bus, rail, cycle, or on foot in London for their journeys. The Mayor wants that to go up to 80%. How he's going to do it in the next, I think it's 2050 he wants to do it by. Incredible to do it. But obviously, we need more railways. Crossrail is nothing new. This is 1941, after the war. Here's Paddington, here's King's Cross. This is a through-running line. Of course, that never happened. I got involved in basically looking at where Crossrail should go. The bit through the middle, the tunnels have been safeguarded since the earlier plans, and that we were stuck with that route. But where it should go at either end, huge exercise to look at all different options. We recommended it should go to Reading, it should go to Watford, and it should go to Ebbsfleet and Sheffield. The report was put into government, and of course they had to do another review, and they said, no, we can't afford all that, we'll cut it back. So they cut out the Watford, they cut out the Ebbsfleet, and initially they cut out back to Maidenhead. But fortunately, pressure has meant that it is now running through to Reading. That's the route through the central area. Just look at some of the Docklands areas. Docklands will have a very, very good service. I mean, Whitechapel will have 24 trains an hour, and the two branches will have 12. I think Reading might have 4 in the peak now. You know, might be changing. Just looking briefly at the station, Whitechapel station, which will massive interchange with the overground. It's very complicated because you've got the overground underneath, you've got the district line, and then you've got Crossrail working its way through. But these are some of the images of where we are now. When you get to Canary Wharf, where can you put it? It goes in the other dock. And this is the station which has been built in that dock. And unlike the Jubilee Line station, because this was planned in conjunction very closely with Canary Wharf, they wanted to have lots of retail. So it's actually got a few, 4, 5, 6 or 7. You have the tracks, you have the ticket hall, you then have 4 stories of bars, restaurants and Willis Reservoir. And on the top you have this fabulous garden. And that is free. You can go and walk through there now. It's a beautiful place, well worth visiting. Going back to Tidal Basin, which is here, or going on to Tidal Basin, this was a construction site. This is where they put in a couple of the tunnel boring machines. And I showed this just look at that site. That's what it looks like today. Development doesn't stop. In the Royals, Crossrail comes through to Custom House, and that's where it does use the old tunnel. It is hoped that this will actually then start to stimulate. I mean, there is development here, there's very little along here. It will actually start to stimulate that area. This, of course, is the Excel Exhibition Centre. This is Custom House Station alongside DLR. It's actually a very cramped station. It's not. I don't think they're quite narrow platforms. It's squeezed in alongside the DLR. Here we have the Connaught Tunnel, which has been the problem of Crossrail, but they have they've reinforced it. They lowered the track, and they are going to use it. This project has hundreds of aspects which are fascinating. There's a lot of information available. The websites are pretty good. Books are being produced. It is an amazing project. Particularly things that people don't really know about. There's high number of UK contracts. Transport has been reused, particularly building a bird sanctuary down in Essex. 1,000 apprentices, 20,000 people through basically what they've set up. It is expensive, but in the long time it will add a lot to London's economy. One good thing is that a good proportion of the workers are women. They have made real efforts. So that's really the story of Docklands Railways. It's not been without its problems. The DLR was torn apart, extended and upgraded. The Jubilee Line and Crossrail have had substantial cost and time overruns. The railways are very, very complicated, and they're getting more complicated. Tunnelling is now actually the easy bit. These marvellous machines which you can steer, millimetres by millimetres, although expensive, can do amazing tunnelling jobs. The stations are getting increasingly complex, and it's basically integrating the systems, all the systems between the stations and the trains. You've got the signalling systems, safety systems, passenger information systems, fire prevention, all these systems. And that's where Crossrail has come adrift. It is a great shame, but hopefully in a year or two, Crossrail is up and running, and we will have forgotten this period. Everybody forgets the Jubilee Line was 18 months, 2 years. Overrun was double its cost. That's history. Crossrail will be the same. So we have in Docklands, the original dock railway was built over 40 years periods, and we've now got basically 4 new railways built over a similar period, 180 years later. And the combination of light rail, metro and regional metro, I think has given Docklands as higher quality network as you would find anywhere in the world. So we have the DLR, we have the Jubilee Line, we have the Underground, and we have Crossrail, and we have a whole lot of very key interchanges. I would hope enough transport to serve Docklands for many years to come. Thank you.
Well, John, that was superb, authoritative and beautifully illustrated. It was a model of how to do things, and certainly I was very keen to let you run on to hear the final end of the story, because that fitted beautifully with Lord Mayor's lectures that he's given at a number of Newcomen branches, talking about the tunnelling aspect of Crossrail that you mentioned, and above all the need to keep Big Ben upright. Okay, I'm sure we'll have some questions, and if not, I've got many, so that's a threat. Yes, please go, fire away.
What's the status of Crossrail 2?
Yes, that's going to.
I would say at the moment it's in the balance. Some money which was going to be used for planning Crossrail 2 has actually been transferred to help with Crossrail 1. I don't think anything will happen on till the decision is made on HS2. And even then, I think the priority will be on HS2 and the Northern Rail. So it's there, it'll be safeguarded, but I don't expect work to start on it very soon.
Is that political?
Political? Well, financial really. I mean, can we afford to do all these?
The way politics are going, they want to encourage more work in the north, don't they?
Exactly, exactly. And there's great debate within my previous profession about whether you should do HS2 first or this northern link. And I think most people on the planning side think you should do the northern link first, because some of those going from Manchester to Leeds, takes hours.
Yes.
I'm not going to be partisan. Yes, fire away.
Yes, there's you mentioned the old dock at Blackwall, indicating you thought it might be Mary Rose date. I think you'll probably find it 1660s. It's mentioned in Pepys when he went there when it was a new dock.
That's right, yes.
And then you, I think, rather disparagingly, said that the King George V dock was built as a post-World War I job creation scheme. Well, that is not true. What was happening before the First World War was, between 1909 and the First World War, the Port of London Authority had been set up, and they had set about putting together a very, very ambitious programme of development for the Port of London over all sorts of things. And the King George V dock was one of the first, one important bits, the big bits to get going, and they started that before the First World War, and work carried on throughout the First World War. And in the last year of the First World War, the Admiralty were putting pressure on them to push it forward quickly so they could get the dry dock open in the King George V dock. Obviously it all slowed down because of that. People weren't available to work because they were off in the trenches and things like that. Now, another thing was, on the question of the Docklands Light Railway, one of the drivers was, I was told by a civil servant that Nigel Brokes said he wouldn't be chairman unless he had a railway. And that would be quite a lot of pressure, I think, because they really wanted him to chair the London Dock Development Corporation right at the very beginning. And then there was how Canary Wharf arrived. You seem to indicate it just sort of happened because of the Americans, and that isn't exactly what happened. What happened was a big American bank, I have to say I've forgotten which one, came to see London Docklands saying they wanted to buy a site on Canary Wharf for 500,000 square feet of office for their back office function in London.
Yes.
And a meeting was arranged between the chief executive, Reg Ward, who was the man with tremendous vision, I have to say, between a senior official of the bank. I've forgotten how high up it was. It might have been very high. And he said, look, we don't want your back office, we want your European head office. Well, you can imagine the response to that. Oh, we're not going to go and do that. There's no one else there. So he more or less said something on the lines, well, go and get other banks and your friends around and get a developer. And they came up with that chap called G. Ware Travelstead, who then put together a scheme, and it jumped within a month from 500,000 square feet to 10 million square feet of office space in 1 month. As a concept, it took a wee while beyond that to get it going. And Travelstead, I think there was a feeling then, we had a new chairman then, called Christopher Benson, who had connections with Olympia and York. And I think he was getting more and more concerned about the ability of Travelsted to raise the necessary funding. Now, Olympia and York were the sort of organisation that don't look for a quick buck. They made their money over a long period, and they were aiming to make money over 15 years. They could back that up with the funding, which is why they got the job. And of course, it started off, and luckily, although they went bust, it came at the end of the first phase of development being complete. So you had a development you could let, and then it all went ahead. The other thing I'd like to just mention quickly was the, you mentioned the, obviously the London-Blackwall Railway is a key part of your talk. In fact, one of the things about that, it really possibly was the world's very first mass rapid transit system, wasn't it? But it was just passengers, wasn't it, at that stage?
Do you know, when that railway was running, it carried 9,000 people a day. When we opened the DLR, it was pretty well exactly the same. I did the passenger forecast of DLR, and I was very nervous because I was quite a young transport planner, and I remember going out with my counter, the count on the first day, and I was pleased to say it was pretty well as expected. But a lovely coincidence that it was. And there are other things which I haven't mentioned, like when the first Blackwall Railway went through its parliamentary bill, there are complaints from the city and others about the noise it would generate. We had exactly the same complaints 100 whatever years later on the DLR. Very similar.
And then, of course, Michael Heseltine was being, well, there was a lot of criticism about how small the railway was, and it wasn't possibly big enough to deal with it. And
it was fine for what was planned at the original.
Well, Michael Heseltine said, look, if he said, we're going to have 10 million square feet of office building down in the Isle of Dogs, it locked him up.
Okay, I think, given your contribution, I suspect there'll be an invitation to the London Topographical Society to John in the very near future. Is that on the cards? Okay, any more questions? Yes, please. Yeah, David.
Could you say why there was the decision to make the DLR automatic trains? Probably went really against the union at the time.
It was interesting. I mean, we did local trams, but I have to say, within London Transport, there was this sort of unease about trams. I mean, I think the people who scrapped them in the 1950s, the ones who were still around, and they didn't like the idea of bringing them back. But it all came down to, essentially, the Development Corporation said, we've got to have something bright and modern, and trams can be a bit old-fashioned. We hadn't actually, I'm trying to think whether the Manchester scheme had opened then. We hadn't got anything to show people about what a modern tram looked like. Another story, I did the planning for the Croydon Tram League, so I'm a tram enthusiast. But yeah, it was all about Development Corporation saying we want something modern, bright, we don't want these old-fashioned trams, let's try and make it automatic. That was a bit of a disaster, because the original automatic system was only had been used in some freight yard in the States and was not properly tested. So those of you who were trying to use the DLR in the early days were subject to quite a few delays.
Gentleman at the back there, and then Roy, and then Frank. Yes.
Me?
Yes, you had your hand up.
Oh yeah. I just have they analysed why these people are travelling on it? What their reason for travelling is?
That happens all the time, and it's a very sophisticated process. Now, when you use your Oyster cards on the network, they know exactly how many people have travelled from A to B. The interesting about the DLR is, if we hadn't had Canary Wharf, we may have had a tube extension. The DLR provides a superb local service, and you get a lot of local people going up to shopping in Stratford and other places, which alternatively would have been on the buses. It really is one of the best local transport systems networks in this country. But it's used, it's overcrowded with commuters. coming from bank and other places, but it's also used by people going to shopping. And lots of people, I remember the first week I opened it, I took that picture of somebody in a wheelchair, and they said, I asked them, and they said, well, I haven't been out on the transport for more than 20 years. This is our first time out. So it really opened up some opportunities for all sorts of other journeys.
Roy?
Only an observation, are profiles on the Dockland Railway as important as like other rails? Because virtually everywhere I look, they seem to have like a flat top on them.
On the rail?
On the actual rail, it's just curious whether it's a
That's
fact.
probably beyond my pay grade. I thought they were standard rails. I mean, they do get a lot of wear because obviously the tight corners and things.
Yeah, it's just an observation. They all seem to have like a flat top on them to me, and I just wonder if it's a factor of the lighter, tops and
I don't know.
tighter turning
Interesting
circles.
question. I might try and find out the answer to that.
Okay.
David, you were... No, well, Frank, David's already had a go, that's right. Sorry, my apologies.
So that's a rather cynical political question about the politics of the proposal, getting the proposal accepted in terms of the initial estimates, the initial amount of time, and then, as you said, everything sort of costs far more, and there's a sort of overrun of time. To what extent, when those initial proposals are made, is that sort of deliberately taken back? Because you did say once or twice that things were thrown out by Parliament because they were too expensive or would take too long. So we say, oh well, let's make it a bit quicker and a bit cheaper, and we'll worry about the other end when we get there.
Well, certainly when we started, I mean, costs had to be kept at the absolute minimum. I mean, we were there was a package put forward by the Department of Transport for Docklands, £100 million. That had to include anything we wanted to do on public transport and roads. So we earmarked 77 million outturn for that, and the rest was on roads. Yes, it's incredibly political. I mean, I always say to people, my colleagues in the construction side, that they've got the easy bit. The hard bit is going through all the processes, getting the statutory approval and getting the political approval.
But my question is, to what extent is this done deliberately by the people proposing the project?
I don't know. It just, I mean, decisions do take sometimes an awful long time, and you have to go through so many hoops with so many different, particularly if you've got local boroughs, you've got to go and consult local people, then you have to go up to the London level, then you have to go up to the government level. Decision-making processes are, I mean, these days they say it takes at least 10 years to build any sort of railway. Crossrail's taken 50 years.
Can I follow on with that with a slightly geeky question, which will reveal my origins as both an economist and also having taught transport economics. You mentioned at an early stage that the Docklands Light Railway was rejected using standard social cost benefit analysis, using presumably the procedures laid down at the time by what would then be the Ministerial Department of Transport. There was a real issue that underlay the whole talk, which is the fact that the traffic generated by these new developments often seemed to far exceed the forecasts. And of course the forecasts underlie the initial cost-benefit analysis. So what was going wrong with the cost-benefit analysis? Was it that no one would believe optimistic forecasts, or was it that the costs were too high? Where's what's underlying the story?
It's basically, you have to convince people that what you've got is your best estimate of demand. I mean, normally you do a low, medium, and a high, and you accept the medium. Nobody will ever accept the high might happen. Just interesting in evaluating these projects, you could write a history of the evaluation of transport projects taking Docklands. The DLR was very, very simple. All we did was study cost benefit. We did this exercise, we looked at, it would generate more jobs. And we did a neat little thing. We estimated that the cost of filling the gap in the cost benefit for those 9,000 jobs worked out about £3,000 a job. Government was paying £5,000 elsewhere for job creation, so it was a good job creation. In those days, that was it. There was no environmental assessment, which came in as we developed the project. Each project almost got a more sophisticated cost benefit. We ended up with Crossrail, which has probably got a very, very sophisticated method now, which actually has influenced how the government lays down how these things should be done. And it's all to do, it's quite a complex economic subject, it's all to do with agglomeration. That you have more businesses of the same together, they react differently than if you spread them apart. That's just a very, very top end. But that is now used, can be used in major cities in the country for assessing projects. And if you do that, you add that in, you get a really good cost benefit for these projects.
So that's the sort of second round clustering benefits that,
Yeah.
the growth engenders growth, and
Exactly.
and you get externalities between the various firms that
Yes,
set up.
that's right. So I say, over 40 years of development of these railways, it's 40 years of the evaluation process.
So the development of the investment appraisal that Frank's talked about is almost going in tandem with the development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nowadays you do the financial appraisal and you do the cost benefit. I've always had a thing about cost benefit because when, for example, when the Victoria Line was approved, the benefits today were almost not taken into account.
Cool. Because of the time horizon.
Because
yeah.
the theory is that a benefit in the future is worth far less than the benefit today. Discounted cash flow, which is crazy. I mean, Victoria today, if you took it away, London would be a disaster, even more of a disaster.
Can I be cheeky and ask a related point? You're saying that the investment appraisal developed in line with the engineering over this 40 years. You also mentioned moving block signalling. Is the technology developing as you learn from each project?
Oh yes. I mean, the DLR did have this very crude automatic system, and it was basically built on the moving block. You know, if there's a train in that block ahead, I'm not going into it. And I think there was one. I haven't kept up to it, but I know that it's the latest fail system now that is operating, which basically doesn't have any blocks. It basically knows where the train in front is. It says that's 50 metres, I can creep up to it. And sometimes they do creep up to within about 20 metres of each other, which is quite alarming if you sit in the front of the train, you see it close and close to one front. Very, very sophisticated. But other things, you can reverse the train in the platform, it comes in. If you go to Bank Station in the old days, sometimes the train used to come to the wrong platform. Or it goes to Canning Town, and the next thing it's going backwards. It's a far cry from those early days. I mean, it's basically simple. The concept is the same. You have 3 computers, 2 of them have got to agree, and you let the train go. In the early days, none of them agreed.
That's a good point to bring in Dan, who would know about these the 3-point system. Go on.
I think that's an interesting point, because over a pint the other day with another computer geek who also happens to like driving steam engines and things like that, he made the point about Crossrail that in fact you're not building a railway. You're building an integrated computer system that happens to actually have a railway in it somewhere.
Yeah.
But it's that problem of actually seeing nowadays, particularly, how all the automation links together, and this now seems to be the problem with Crossrail,
Yeah.
that, you know, people have interpreted the latitude on the specs, and one of them's gone to that end of the latitude, and the other's gone there, and they miss quite neatly in
But
the
if you
middle.
built it in a desert, it would be difficult enough.
Yeah.
Building it in, you know, major cities in the world, having to cope with 4 different signalling systems.
Mm.
So the trains have to be intelligent. Oh, which signalling system am
Where
I
are
on
we
now?
now?
Oh, I'm in automatic. Okay, driver can stop, take his hands off. And then you come, oh, we've got to go on to the Great Western. Oh, we're going to Heathrow, that's a different. I mean, it's a nightmare.
It's interesting. You're talking about keeping Big Ben upright. I'm told that the lecture room that Glias uses has a very slight rise in the middle of it,
Right.
because when they were compensating grouting for Crossrail going underneath it, they just gave it an extra squirt, and it's the only problem being, of course, that the people who owned the building were the people who designed the compensating grouting, so they can't really sue themselves. You know.
Well, when that happened, I mean, I talked to John Boland about it, and he said, because he was off doing other things, there was no email then, it was all done by fax.
Yeah.
And about every hour he used to get this fax and said, it's moved that much. And so he had to give back, well, put in another few pounds of compensation grouting. I mean, obviously it's a lot more sophisticated today.
Oh, David, come on again. Yeah, I did ask you.
A couple of points. One is that, you know, another railway that has come through London, really not knowing Docklands, is this wonderful, what we now call Thameslink. It was originally called 2000. Thameslink 2000, and it took 19 years. But we've had a year worth of the new signalling system actually not working at Farringdon Station, where they were trying to get from King's Cross down, maybe Blackfriars, with the new signalling system, but it does seem to be sorted now.
Yeah.
But it's taken a year
It
of
has taken a long
tweaking the programming to do that. But really, that feeds into South London, and in fact, looking at all your maps, in fact, South London does seem to get a raw showing.
It does.
And we've got old developments, we've got a complete rebuild of Canary Wharf, no, Canada Water, I should say. Canada Water about to take place. We've got the old.
Not bad, is it?
London Bridge is not bad, but I didn't. If I'd held my breath for it to be finished, and it still isn't finished. You know, you've got a situation where you've got the old redevelopment of the old newspaper works in what was it, Deptford Dockyard.
Yes.
Planning for those things, there is no public transport.
No. It's a lot of
None
gaps.
whatsoever.
Well, there are ideas for Bakerloo extension.
But that's going to be further south, from Peckham
yes.
into maybe Lewisham, maybe somewhere else. I haven't quite decided yet. There's still time to put in your objections.
Just going back to Farringdon, I worry about Farringdon. I mean, Farringdon, north, south and east, west with Crossrail, it's going to be massive interchanges there. And the old Farringdon platforms are just so narrow.
Yeah.
I worry about it. But I may be proved wrong.
Well,
Blame the Victorians for that.
Yes.
One last question then, I think the gentleman at the back again.
Yeah, the Docklands got this signalling that allows it to run automatically.
Yes.
But what is different about that signalling than the ones that run on the other railway networks that stop them being automatic?
Basically, because they're more complicated. The plan, which has already started, is to make the district circle and Met lines automatic. It's already started. If you, I think, you can go from Hammersmith to not quite into Paddington. That is now running on this moving block.
Euston Square.
Is that right?
Euston Square, Hammersmith.
To Euston, it goes to, yes, it runs Euston
That's
Square.
why there's been such chaos on the
There's always chaos when we introduce the new
on that
system.
part there where they say well, trains failed at Euston Square. No, it's not the train, it's the signalling system.
But that has started. I mean, if they can get that, I mean, that is such a complicated network because you've got all these flat junctions, you know, the corners of the circle line. But that's the aim, to make this, if they can make that automatic. I mean, the Central Line obviously already is. Victoria Line is similar. My first job was in the underground. I joined as signal engineer, and it was making the clocks work on the Victoria Line, just as it was opening.
Okay, making the clocks work is a perfect pretext for me to say the clock is working against us, and unfortunately on this splendid evening I'm sure this discussion could continue. We do have to call a halt, but I think we really ought to thank John for an excellent and beautifully illustrated and authoritative paper tonight. Our very warmest thanks to you.
I just have an advert. I do hope you'll all come to Crofton next summer.
Yes.
Peter, Toby there, and I will make a good day for you. And I will show you something very exciting. When you read your next links, you will see an article written about me, about marrying 200 years of technology at Crofton. I'll leave it at that. Just read the article. Okay, that's the Crofton picnic. Again, details in the forthcoming links, which I know is printed now. Two quick announcements. The next meeting is Richard Williams on great metallurgical myths of 18th century iron making, and I've asked Dr. Fred Starr to be the discussant, and I hope to see other people. I'm certainly going to lobby the Historical Metallurgy Society to come along. There's a change of lecture subject in February. Rose Tenby is unable to give her scheduled lecture, which is Isambard, Kingdom, Brunel and Robert Howlett. And so instead, Dr. Nina Baker, I'm delighted to say, will speak on From Airships to the Space Race, Some Women and Their Engineering Achievements. So that will be a treat to look forward to. It finally remains for me to wish you all a very happy Christmas and an excellent New Year, and see you back here again on Wednesday the 8th of January. Thank you. We are also going to dinner at our usual place, joining John, taking John to dinner. You're very welcome to join us. Thank you very much.